Solo camping. I have been into solo camping for quite a while now. Solo camping sounds cool, but all I do is drive into the mountains on weekends and camp in random places. This was a strange experience that happened one Sunday near the end of summer. We loaded our gear into the car around noon and left the house. The sky was not quite clear, but it was lightly overcast. I was driving along my usual route. I always camp solo at the same place, a riverside in the mountains about an hour from my house. I can't count how many times I've been there. There is a reason for that. It was about 3 years ago now. At that time I had a wife and an 8-year-old son, though only one. I was a company employee, and we bought a small 2-story house in the suburbs, where we lived an ordinary life. One day during summer vacation, my son Takashi wanted to go camping, so we decided to go out as a family to the nearby mountains. We pitched a tent by a riverside in the mountains and enjoyed fishing and barbecuing during the day and fireworks at night. That night, when the family was sleeping in the small tent, the 3 of us were lying on the river. When we were finally about to fall asleep, Takashi, who was standing beside me, shook me by the shoulder. I asked him, "What's wrong?" "I have to pee," to which he replied, "Go pee by the river there." Takashi did as he was told and left the tent by himself. Tired from the daytime, I went straight to sleep. But that was the beginning of my great regret. The next morning I must have slept very soundly, because my wife shook me by the shoulders and I opened my eyes. There was my wife's face, with a grim expression on her face. She said, Hey, Takashi, don't you know?" "What?" I looked to the side and saw that Takashi was gone. He rushed out of the tent and looked around, but could not find him. The couple searched for him until after dark that day, but to no avail. In the end, when we called the police, it was pitch black. For the next 6 months, the police, the local fire brigade, and many other people worked tirelessly to find him. The police, the local fire brigade, and many other people worked hard to find our son. My wife and I, of course, but we could not find even one of his shoes. From then on, my wife blamed me for everything. "If only you had been there for our son at that time, none of this would have happened." She told me that it would have been the same as if you had killed him. I had always felt that we had different values, but I think that Takashi was the one who somehow connected my wife and me. So a year after our son's disappearance, my wife and I became strangers. Having not had lunch, I pulled into a deserted drive-in at the foot of the mountain. A rusty tin sign with vertical writing along the road read "Drive-in Hiroshi." The spacious parking lot was deserted and somewhat lonely. The building looks like a converted prefab structure. The showcase next to the entrance has samples of the menu, but the glass of the case is so dirty that I could not see the prices or names of the dishes clearly. When I entered the restaurant, as I expected, there were no customers. There were about 4 cheap tables and a counter in the back. I sat in the middle of the counter. After a while, a tired old man appeared from the kitchen behind the counter. He has a square cropped head, a stubble beard, and a thickly built frame, wearing only a running shirt on top and a black jersey underneath. He silently places a glass of water in front of me. I order my ramen and he disappears into the kitchen, again without saying a word. As I finished my ramen, which was a hair short of instant ramen, I casually looked around and noticed a framed picture of a man in the corner of the counter. I got up and went closer to take a look. There was a picture of a man who appeared to be the owner of the restaurant with a boy of elementary school age. They were standing side by side on a large rock. The two were standing side by side on a large rock, getting along well with each other. "It's my son, Hiroshi." I turn around in surprise, and before I know it, the owner is standing behind me. He was a boy who loved fishing. We used to go to the nearby river together. Was he? The owner sat down on a round chair and continued. "It was 30 years ago. During summer vacation, Hiroshi and I went fishing in the river there. While Hiroshi was fishing, I was smoking a cigarette and drinking a can of beer in the shade of a tree. How long had it been since then? It was around the time when the surface of the river began to be tinted by the evening sunlight. I asked Hiroshi if it was time to go home, but he didn't answer. I looked around, but I couldn't find him. In the end, that was it. The shopkeeper said and hung his head in disappointment. We are similar, I thought. I told the owner about my son who disappeared 3 years ago. The owner just listened in silence, and then he began to talk about this. He told me this story about his grandmother, who had passed away many years ago, but who lived alone in a shrine behind our store. It was when there were still samurai. It was when there were still samurai. In a village around here, there was a beautiful, fair-skinned woman who lived alone with her son. The woman loved her son very much. But one day, her son drowned in the river and died. The woman grieves, and day after day she stands by the river, calling her son's name. Then one day, at last, the woman transformed herself into a white serpent and disappeared into the river. After that, it is said that things like a boy playing in the river was hidden by the gods began to happen. The villagers were terrified, saying it was the curse of the white serpent. When I set up my tent by the usual riverside, sat down on a rock, and opened a can of beer, the sun had already begun to tilt toward the west, and the river surface and the surrounding area were tinged with vermilion. All that could be heard now was the refreshing sound of the river and the cicadas' ear-splitting cries. I downed my beer in one gulp and thought back to what the owner had told me earlier. Did the owner and my son get taken by a white snake, too? No, that was just a legend, and in this day and age, there is no way that could have happened. We set up a barbecue set in front of the tent, picked up some dead wood to make a fire, and grilled the meat we had prepared, drinking beer and tapping our tongues. After that, it was the usual ritual. We take out the sparklers that Takashi used to love from his backpack, sit down on a rock, and light them with a lighter. As I stared at the crackling sparks in the darkness, I could vividly recall that happy summer day. It was right then. Dad. I heard a child's voice coming from somewhere. I looked up with a start and saw, Takashi. Is that you? He said, scurrying around. I stood up and called out again to the darkness, but there was still no answer. I shrugged my shoulders in disappointment, cleaned up the area, put out the fire, and went inside the tent, turned off the lamp, and lay down. In the darkness, all I could hear was the sound of the river running and the occasional strange chirping of birds. How much time had passed since then? Just as my consciousness was about to be finally submerged in the fountain of sleep, I heard the sound of splashing water from the river. I wondered if it was a fish jumping. At first, I thought so. But the sound did not stop. I got up and quietly peeked out of the tent's entrance. The next moment, my heart began to beat wildly. There was someone in the middle of the river. It is a woman with only her waist up to the surface of the water. Under the moonlight, a woman with a translucent white skin and naked upper body was leaning her body at an angle, her long black hair tied up in a bundle with both hands. Droplets of water were dripping from the ends of her hair. Her profile, illuminated by the moonlight, was pale and divinely beautiful. Pulled by a magnetic force, I stepped out of the tent and staggered to the riverbank. The woman, perhaps noticing me, slowly lowered herself into the water, her face just above the surface, and quietly began to move forward. Then, behind her, a long, white, log-like body followed her, undulating on the surface of the water. When I saw the shiny, eerily white body passing in front of me, I involuntarily exclaimed, "Ah!" I let out an involuntary. What looks like a human face is stuck here and there on the white, soft-looking body protected by scales, and not just one or two. Countless faces lined up in endless rows, like the windows of a train. When I looked closely at them, I saw that they were all the faces of young boys. And among them, there was one face I will never forget. Takashi. I entered the river barefoot and followed the long, white body as it moved forward. Staggering and soaking wet, I desperately chased after it, but it quickly moved upstream and dissolved into the blackness of the river. I stood there, staring at the mountain range in the distance, stunned. This is the end of this story. Thank you for listening to the end.